The year is 1692. The air in the small village of Salem is thick with an unspoken tension. Something is deeply wrong here. A shadow has fallen over this community. It is a fear of the unknown, of the supernatural, of a hidden evil that villagers believe walks among them. But here, in this climate of heightened anxiety and religious fervor, they are seen as something more sinister. The church, the very center of village life, is no longer just a place of peaceful worship. Every word feeds the growing paranoia, turning suspicion into certainty and unease into outright terror. This was the era of the great witch hunts, a time when fear was a weapon and an accusation was as good as a death sentence. We are about to step back into that world, a world where your neighbor could be your accuser. The belief in magic is as old as humanity. For years, people believed in charms and spirits that could influence the world. But during the late Middle Ages, something began to shift. The church started to view old beliefs through a darker lens. Any magic not performed by God must come from Satan. The village healer was a potential agent of the devil. The Malleus Maleficarum became a handbook for witch hunters across Europe. This transformed the witch into an enemy of God and state. When war brought devastation, it was the witches. It gave people a terrifying explanation for a chaotic world. It was easier to blame a hidden enemy, making the witch hunt inevitable. The witch trials were deeply entangled with power and politics. Rulers saw the witch hunt as a tool for control in an era of upheaval. By launching a witch hunt, a ruler could demonstrate authority and moral righteousness. It was a way to unite a fractured community against a common enemy. Accusing a rival territory of harboring witches became a common political tactic. The witch trial became a public spectacle designed to inspire both fear and loyalty. Faith itself became a weapon in the battle between Catholics and Protestants. Ultimately, the witch trials reveal a dark truth about the human desire for order. They were born from genuine fear, manipulated faith, and cold political calculation. The figure of the witch provided the perfect target. Understanding this toxic brew is the key to unlocking the tragic history of the witch trials. To understand the witch hunt, we must step into the 15th century. It was a world of supernatural belief where God and the devil constantly intervened. Every event was a sign. Life was precarious. Famine, plague, and war were constant threats. Without modern science, people sought answers in the supernatural, a mix of Christian teachings and pagan beliefs. This blend was common across Europe. Magic was a real force used for good or ill. Communities were small and isolated. Closeness bred suspicion. An old woman could easily become a target. Everyday rivalries became the soil for the witch hunt. They believed they were in a cosmic war, vulnerable, and looked for someone to blame. As the Middle Ages closed, religious authorities focused that blame onto the witch. During the High Middle Ages, the Catholic Church combated heresy, beliefs contradicting official doctrine. The Church established the Inquisition, a legal body tasked with rooting out heretics. Initially, the Church distinguished between folk magic and diabolical witchcraft. Theologians argued that any magic not from God must come from a demonic source. Village magic was reclassified as a pact with the devil himself. The witch transformed into an enemy of all humanity. It was about renouncing God, worshipping the devil, and joining a secret conspiracy. This had deadly real-world consequences, giving authorities justification to persecute witches. In 1487, the Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, was published. Written by German Inquisitors, it became the definitive handbook on witchcraft for centuries. The book was a chilling guide that detailed the supposed nature of witches, how to identify them and prosecute them. Divided into 3 parts, it sought to prove witchcraft was real, described its forms, and provided a procedural guide for judges. It endorsed torture and provided justification for brutal persecution, giving authorities a license to kill. The printing press ensured its spread, influencing magistrates and judges across Europe. It standardized the idea of diabolical witch conspiracies, turning fears into a deadly legal process. By the end of the 15th century, the intellectual and legal frameworks were in place. But it took a period of profound crisis to turn theory into widespread bloody practice. The period from roughly 1560 to 1660 was a time of unprecedented turmoil in Europe. This era, the Little Ice Age, brought colder winters and wetter summers, leading to repeated crop failures. The Protestant Reformation had shattered the religious unity of Europe, sparking brutal religious wars. The witch trial was a terrifyingly effective tool of social control, demonstrating power and piety. This perfect storm created a world ripe for scapegoating. It was the witches, working in league with the devil, who were causing all this chaos. The hunt was on. The 16th century brought a religious earthquake to Europe. The Protestant Reformation, sparked by figures like Martin Luther and John Calvin, shattered the dominance of the Catholic Church. This immense religious conflict created a climate of deep-seated anxiety and spiritual insecurity. This new religious landscape was a breeding ground for paranoia, each side seeing the devil's hand at work in the other. The figure of the witch became the ultimate symbol of that internal corruption. The Reformation ended up creating a world so divided and so fearful that it made the great European witch hunts possible. In post-Reformation Europe, faith was a powerful political tool. Kings and magistrates were under pressure to demonstrate their legitimacy. By launching campaigns against witches, rulers sent a clear message and positioned themselves as God's defenders. Witch hunts became political theater, a spectacle of state power. In the Holy Roman Empire, local princes used witch trials to assert authority. The fires of the witch pyre were meant to illuminate the power of the prince. Accusations of witchcraft became a weapon against political opponents. The fear of accusations silenced dissent, making the populace easier to govern. Ultimately, the politics of piety created a deadly feedback loop, growing more intense and deadly. The witch was an enemy of the state, her prosecution unifying the population and consolidating power. The Great Witch Hunt was the result of a tense partnership between religious institutions and secular governments. The Church provided the theological justification, defining witchcraft and stirring fear, but the state's cooperation was required to execute accused witches. This created a lethal alliance. This partnership wasn't always smooth, with power struggles over the legal process. Centralized inquisitions led to fewer executions due to stricter evidence rules, but fragmented authority led to brutal hunts where legal standards were abandoned. This tension between religious ideology and state power is key to understanding the witch trials. The witch was now officially a criminal, an enemy of the state and God. This fusion created the deadly engine that drove the witch-hunting machine across Europe. In the 16th and 17th centuries, people saw their world as a battleground between God and Satan. Every misfortune, war, plague, or personal loss was evidence of this cosmic struggle. The witch was seen as a traitor, an agent of the devil within the community. Trials focused on forcing confessions of allegiance to Satan, transforming legal proceedings into rituals of purification. Torture was justified as a way to break the devil's hold and save the soul, even as the body was condemned. Public executions served as warnings, uniting communities against a common enemy. The witch hunts were the tragic result of a world consumed by fear and division. Witch hunts often began with a whisper, a rumor sparked by misfortune. Outsiders or those with strained relationships became easy targets as fear spread. Gossip grew into consensus, and soon the community identified its witch. Accusations, built on anecdotes and suspicion, were brought to authorities eager to act. A warrant was issued, and the accused was publicly arrested, stripped of dignity and support. The community watched, both fearful and fascinated, as the accused was imprisoned. For most, the accusation alone sealed their fate. The machinery of persecution was now in motion. Imprisoned, the accused faced relentless psychological torment. Examinations were designed to secure confessions, not discover truth. Searches for the devil's mark and humiliating ordeals broke down resistance. Sleep deprivation and isolation left the accused confused and vulnerable. Denial was seen as proof of guilt. Confession confirmed it. Ordeals like the water test offered no escape. Sink and die innocent, float and be condemned. The process was a trap with no path to innocence. The examination was a nightmare from which few emerged unscathed. When confessions didn't come, torture was used to break the accused. Devices like the Strapado thumbscrews and spiked chairs inflicted unbearable pain. Under torture, victims confessed to impossible crimes, repeating scripts fed by interrogators. Forced to name accomplices, the accused triggered new waves of arrests. Torture turned suspicion into a self-perpetuating panic, consuming entire communities. The truth extracted was nothing but fear and agony. The cycle of accusation and confession spiraled out of control. The trial was a public ritual, not a search for truth. Confessions, often obtained by torture, were read aloud as proof of guilt. Evidence rules favored the accusers. Defense was futile. Retracting a confession was dismissed as the devil's trick. The verdict was almost always guilty, and the sentence was death, by hanging or burning. Executions were staged as purifying acts, meant to terrify and unite the community. The spectacle masked persecution as justice. The final act was not just punishment, but a warning to all. The execution of a convicted witch was the final, terrible climax. It was a highly organized public event. The condemned was led on a final procession through the town. Priests would walk alongside, urging a final confession. The execution site was usually a prominent place. The execution was a powerful sermon delivered with fire and flesh, a warning to anyone straying from norms. The official sentence would be read, the condemned bound, and the executioner would light the pyre. The sight and smell were intended to be seared into memory. As the flames consumed the victim, the community felt catharsis. But this relief was often short-lived, and the cycle would often begin again. The story of witch trials crossed the Atlantic with the first colonists. These English Puritans sought to build a new society, a city upon a hill. They saw themselves as modern-day Israelites, escaping the old world to create a new Jerusalem. This mission burdened them with anxiety. They believed God's wrath would fall upon them if they failed to maintain perfect piety. The colonists faced a vast, untamed wilderness that they viewed with terror. They believed these woods were the devil's last stronghold. Constant threats of starvation, disease, and conflicts with native populations reinforced this paranoid worldview. Every setback was interpreted as a spiritual attack. The Puritans believed the devil was a real and active force, granting witches the power to torment and disrupt their communities. Decades before Salem, New England had seen witchcraft accusations and executions. This normalized prosecuting witches as a defense for their fragile society. Therefore, the crisis in Salem in 1692 was the culmination of generations of anxiety. The Puritans' religious fervor, combined with frontier life and colonial wars, created a perfect storm. They were a people primed for panic, living on the edge of the world, looking for signs of the devil's work. The wilderness was not just outside their settlements. They feared it was inside their communities. It would take only a small spark to ignite this tinderbox of fear. In the cold winter of 1692, the crisis began in Salem village, at Reverend Samuel Parris's home. His daughter and niece began to exhibit terrifying symptoms, soon afflicting other young women. A local doctor diagnosed bewitchment, turning a family matter into a public emergency. Pressured to name their tormentors, the girls accused social outcasts, Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. Tituba's confession of witchcraft ignited the community's fears. Accusations spread, fueled by spectral visions accepted as evidence. The spark erupted into a firestorm of hysteria, engulfing the entire colony. With Tituba's confession, the witch hunt spun out of control. Accusations targeted respectable community members. The logic was terrifying. The devil would corrupt the heart of the Puritan community. Soon, church members and landowners were accused and imprisoned. The afflicted girls held a terrifying power of life and death. During examinations, girls writhed, screamed, and claimed to see specters. These displays were treated as undeniable proof. The panic spread and jails overflowed. Accusations settled old scores. In May 1692, a special court was established. Lacking legal training and assuming spectral evidence was valid, the court expedited convictions, marking an official escalation. The court of Oyer and Terminer began in June 1692. Bridget Bishop was the first to trial. She was found guilty and hanged on Gallows Hill. Over the next few months, 19 were convicted and hanged. Giles Corey was pressed with stones. The accusers grew bolder, even accusing the governor's wife. In October, Governor Phipps forbade spectral evidence and dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer. The Salem witch trials were over. When we picture a witch from this era, a specific image often comes to mind. An old, stooped woman, perhaps with a wart on her nose, living alone on the edge of town. There is some truth to this stereotype. A significant number of the accused were indeed older women, particularly widows or those who never married. In a society where a woman's status was tied to her husband and family, these women were often socially isolated and economically vulnerable. They lived on the margins, sometimes relying on the charity of their neighbors to survive. This dependency could easily curdle into resentment, making them perfect scapegoats when misfortune struck. Their age and isolation made them both feared and powerless. However, the net of accusation was cast much wider than just this single group. The accused came from all walks of life, and the profile could change dramatically depending on the time and place of the hunt. Midwives and folk healers were particularly vulnerable. Their work placed them at the crossroads of life and death. If a baby was stillborn or a patient died despite their remedies, suspicion could easily fall upon them. Their knowledge of herbs and traditional healing, once respected, was reinterpreted through the dark lens of demonology as evidence of a diabolical pact. They were women of power in a world that distrusted female authority, and their skills made them easy targets. Men and children were not immune. While women made up the vast majority of victims, roughly 20% of those accused and executed were men. Male victims were often the husbands or sons of accused witches, condemned by association. Others were targeted for social or political reasons, accused of witchcraft as a convenient way to eliminate a rival. Children were also caught in the crossfire, both as accusers and as the accused. In some of the larger panics, authorities became convinced that witches were recruiting children into their ranks, leading to the horrifying spectacle of children being interrogated and even executed for witchcraft. Ultimately, the most dangerous characteristic a person could have was simply being different. Anyone who stood out from the rigid social norms of the time could become a target. This included those who were argumentative, those who held unpopular opinions, those who suffered from mental illness or physical deformities, and those who simply had a string of bad luck. The accused were not monsters in league with the devil. They were overwhelmingly ordinary people, trapped by the fears and prejudices of their time. They were the outliers, the inconvenient, and the unfortunate, sacrificed on the altar of their community's anxieties. Just as the accused were a diverse group, so too were their accusers. Their motivations were a complex and often dark mixture of genuine belief, personal malice, and psychological pressure. At the forefront, especially in cases like Salem, were the afflicted. These were often young women who claimed to be the direct victims of witchcraft, suffering from fits, visions, and physical torment. Some historians believe they were suffering from genuine psychological or neurological conditions, like conversion disorder, amplified by the intense religious atmosphere. Others suggest they were caught up in a form of mass hysteria, where the behavior of one girl would trigger similar symptoms in her peers. Beyond the genuinely afflicted, however, were those who accused others for far more cynical and worldly reasons. The witch trials provided a perfect opportunity to settle old scores. A long-running feud with a neighbor over a piece of land could be decisively ended with a witchcraft accusation. A business rival could be eliminated, or a personal debt could be erased if the creditor was imprisoned or executed. In the claustrophobic world of village life, where grudges could simmer for generations, the witch hunt became a weapon of personal vengeance, cloaked in the righteous language of a holy war. The fear of witchcraft gave people a license to act on their worst impulses. Psychological factors also played a huge role. For some, being an accuser offered a sudden and intoxicating taste of power. A young servant girl, normally at the bottom of the social ladder, could suddenly hold the fate of a wealthy landowner in her hands. Her words, once ignored, were now listened to with rapt attention by the most powerful men in the community. This newfound influence and attention could be a powerful motivator, encouraging them to continue and even embellish their accusations. It gave a voice to the voiceless and a strange, terrible power to the powerless, creating a dynamic where accusations were likely to multiply. Of course, we cannot discount genuine fear. Many, if not most, accusers truly believed in the reality of witchcraft. They were terrified. When their child fell sick or their livestock died, they genuinely believed they were under demonic attack. In their minds, pointing the finger at a suspected witch was not a malicious act, but a desperate act of self-defense. They saw themselves as victims fighting back against an insidious evil that threatened their families, their souls, and their entire community. This potent combination of genuine terror, personal vendettas, and psychological rewards created the accusers who drove the deadly machinery of the trials forward. The witch trials were a community drama, and the public played a crucial role. Neighbours provided initial evidence, gossip, and rumors that turned suspicion into accusation. Their collective testimony gave weight to the complaint. The crowd's fear was essential for the process to begin. During the trial, the public transformed into spectators, eager to witness the drama. The trials were a form of grim entertainment. The crowd's reactions could pressure the judges. At the execution, the crowd played its final role. The public burning was a community ritual. The crowd's presence turned the death into a collective act of purification. It was a terrifying lesson for all who watched. The crowd was an essential component, its fears fueling accusations and influencing verdicts. The public was both the audience and the enabler of the spectacle. While the witch hunts were fueled by mass panic, it is crucial to remember that not everyone was swept away by the hysteria. Even at the height of the persecution, there were brave individuals who dared to question the narrative. These skeptics came from all levels of society, from humble farmers to educated judges and theologians. They raised their voices against the madness, often at great personal risk. To doubt the reality of the witch hunt was to risk being labeled a sympathizer, an atheist, or even a witch yourself. It took immense courage to stand against the overwhelming tide of public opinion and official certainty. One of the earliest and most powerful critiques came from a German priest named Cornelius Loos. In 1592, he wrote a book challenging the belief in witchcraft and condemning the cruelty of the trials he had witnessed. Before his book could even be published, he was arrested by the Inquisition, forced to recant his views publicly, and imprisoned. His manuscript was confiscated and thought lost for 300 years. His story shows the immense danger faced by those who spoke out. The authorities did not tolerate dissent and were willing to use their power to silence any voice that challenged the legitimacy of the hunts. Other critics focused on the legal process itself, particularly the use of torture to extract confessions. Thinkers like the Jesuit poet Friedrich Spee, who had acted as a confessor to condemned witches in Germany, was horrified by what he saw. He wrote a book, published anonymously in 1631, arguing that torture was producing an endless stream of false confessions. He famously stated that if the process were applied to the judges and inquisitors themselves, they would all confess to being witches. His powerful arguments from an insider's perspective helped to slowly turn the tide among legal scholars and more conscientious rulers. These voices of doubt were initially a tiny minority, easily drowned out by the roar of the crowd and the proclamations of the authorities. They did not stop the witch hunts overnight. However, their persistent arguments planted crucial seeds of skepticism. They chipped away at the intellectual and legal foundations of the persecution. They forced people to confront the moral and logical fallacies at the heart of the trials. These courageous doubters, the few who dared to apply reason and compassion in an age of fear, were the first signs of the dawn that would eventually bring an end to this long and tragic night. The great witch hunts ended because Europe underwent an irreversible intellectual transformation. The Age of Enlightenment championed reason and scientific inquiry over superstition. Thinkers revealed a universe operating by natural laws, leaving less room for supernatural interventions. As science offered rational explanations, the witch hunt's intellectual foundations crumbled. Judges demanded empirical proof. Tales extracted during interrogations seemed absurd. Leaders viewed witch trials as barbaric. Enlightenment thinkers championed individual rights. Torture and spectral visions became morally repugnant. This reframed witch hunts from pious duty into criminal injustice. The fire of the witch hunt was extinguished by the light of reason, As the intellectual climate changed, so too did the legal systems that had enabled the witch hunts. Legal reformers grew louder and more influential, launching an attack on legal procedures that had guaranteed convictions for centuries. The most critical target of their criticism was the use of judicial torture. Reformers argued that torture produced falsehoods, and governments began to listen. One by one, states across Europe began to reform their legal codes, placing strict limits on the use of torture or abolishing it altogether. Without torture, prosecutors found it nearly impossible to prove the pact with the devil. Spectral evidence was increasingly dismissed as unreliable. Judges began to demand the same standard of proof for witchcraft as they did for any other crime. Higher appellate courts began to systematically overturn witchcraft convictions from lower courts. By making the trials legally unworkable, the state effectively dismantled the machinery of the hunt. The end of the witch trials didn't end fear. New scapegoats emerged. Anxieties shifted to political conspiracies. The enemy became the secret revolutionary, the anarchist, or the foreign spy. Fears once aimed at destroying Christendom were now aimed at secret societies orchestrating wars from the shadows. Language used to describe these enemies mirrored that of witches, a hidden force corrupting the nation. The scapegoating remained, fitting new anxieties. Those once accused of witchcraft were now medicalized, confined for failing to conform. This shift shows a change in how societies conceptualize danger. The threat became political and social, teaching us that blaming a group for suffering is a deeply ingrained human tendency. The great witch hunts may seem like a distant chapter from a barbaric past. It is a timeless parable about the mechanics of fear, the dangers of certainty, and the fragility of justice. The pyres have long gone cold, but the dark human impulses that built them remain. We see these same patterns repeating throughout history. The names and the accusations change, but the underlying psychology of the hunt remains disturbingly familiar. This history serves as a profound warning about the relationship between belief, power, and justice. Ultimately, the dark truth behind the witch trials is not about the devil, but about us. It is about arming ourselves with the wisdom to ensure that the fires of intolerance and persecution are never allowed to be lit again.